And I will also start with some sort of a confession that I feel a slight discomfort to talk about Latin physiognomy around 1500 in a conference dedicated to the study of Western esotericism. I have been working over the last 15 years or so on various aspects of the history of medieval Latin physiognomy, stressing again and again its learned dimension, preaching repeatedly that we should not anachronistically relegate this branch of knowledge to the realm of esotericism when we study it as historians, but rather view it as 13th, 14th, and 15th century natural philosophers and physicians did, namely as a respectable science. Michael Scotus, Albertus Magnus, Pietro d'Abano, Jean Buridan, all renowned natural philosophers. Rolandus Scriptoris, the dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris in the 1420s, Michele Savonarola, an eminent court physician in Ferrara and a prolific medical writing, are just few famous names deeply involved in theoretical physiognomic thinking, which characterize the highest echelons of European intellectuals between 1200 and 1500. Not all of them, many of them. For me, physiognomy and esotericism don't mix well together. But despite this discomfort, I'm delighted with the opportunity to test again my conviction that medieval Latin physiognomy between 1200 and 1500 cannot simply be viewed as many view physiognomy today, when they come across a plethora of publications such as this one, which probably many of you have come across. I picked it on a recent visit to the shrine of Kever Uziel in Uziel, yes. Ben Uziel, no? Jonathan Ben Uziel, yes. In the Upper Galilee, just for curiosity. It's a book on Chokhmat HaPartzuf, wisdom of the face, so popular physiognomy being sold today on various places, and this is just one example. I hope that people view this physiognomy as pseudoscience at best, or even a garbled hodgepodge of magical nonsense. But more than that, I hope that my paper, together with Raimund's paper and the other two papers dedicated to the theme of esotericism and science, will stimulate a debate about the problematic and perhaps artificial dichotomy between science and esotericism in pre-modern societies. In what follows, I will briefly summarize my findings so far concerning the scientific status of physiognomy between 1200 and 1500, and then I will quickly proceed to a single case study of physiognomy around 1500 in the context of the history of scientific observation. Physiognomy belongs to a group of practices, including medicine, that revolve around the semiotics of the body. The physiognomer has always used the same analytical categories: color, movement, shape, texture, temperature, that help the physician determine a diagnosis. Now, what really lies behind this symptomatic model shared, in this case, by medicine and physiognomy? Intuition, access to occult or even divine knowledge, or a solid theoretical framework which can crown these practices, the physiognomic practices, with the desired diadem of a science, a scientia? If this question were asked before the year 1200 in the Latin West, I presume the answer would probably have been that with this kind of knowledge, factors are at play which cannot be measured with a glance and intuition. But parallel to what is now a well-documented process that led to the recognition of medicine as a medieval science, a similar, though a slightly slower, process can be detected with physiognomy. The great contribution of the Latin Middle Ages to physiognomy would be to free it from this intuitive, conjectural stage by supplying it with a firm theoretical foundation. But this happened gradually and not without some serious opposition. The long list of signs and significances, very often badly ordered and unsystematic, and always lacking any attempt to provide some sort of physical causal explanation, could not be received to the pantheon of the sciences just like that. The approach of combination of evidence, whereby several pieces of evidence support a specific conclusion, even if the individual pieces are weak, adopted by ancient physiognomers to stabilize the uncertainty characterizing the subject, did not remove the doubts engulfing physiognomy. Something else was needed. From the late 12th century, two important classical authorities, which became available to all, provided significant arguments in support of those critical of physiognomy's uncertainty and lack of explanatory value. First, there was Galen, who in De Complexionibus subtly inserted a severe critique of physiognomers when comparing them to physicians. Galen openly criticized the physiognomists for failing to address the issue of causation, i.e., what is the reason for a behavioral pattern which follows a certain bodily sign. Then there was Pliny the Elder, who throughout the 13th and 14th centuries was by far less trendy than in the 15th and 16th centuries, but whose critique of Aristotle's interest in physiognomy was generally available through its incorporation into Vincent of Beauvais' encyclopedic Speculum Naturale. In Book 11 of his Natural History, Pliny considered the conclusions of physiognomy frivolous and expressed his surprise that the great Aristotle considered them worthy of his teaching. Under attack were physiognomy's prognostic pretenses, as well as its role as a decoder of human character. I've recently studied the scholastic discourse among philosophers and physicians who were fervently discussing the status of physiognomy as a valid science. It seems that learned 13th and 14th century physiognomers, mainly philosophers, to judge by the authors of treatises on physiognomy, did not feel threatened by this Plinian or Galenic critique, for there is no direct references to it in their writing. Only around 1500 do we find, for the first time, in a physiognomic text, direct and apologetic reference to the Plinian challenge to the theory of and practice of physiognomy, and I will come back to this text shortly. And this is perhaps not surprising, furnished but what they believed was a body of knowledge fully endorsed and partly invented by Aristotle, authority was on their side. Despite constant doubts, physiognomy was recognized by them as a body of knowledge deeply rooted in a sound theoretical basis and characterized by stability and certainty. As a demonstrative science, it was expected to provide rational explanation for every bodily sign and not only a description of its meaning. By 1300, two theoretical frameworks, especially the medical complexional, but also the astrological one, were available for those who wished to anchor physiognomic science to the conventional scientific context. Physiognomy's portrayal as part of the secrets literature in the realm of the realm of the occult was essentially relegated to the margins of its discourse. Now, let me exemplify my approach to late medieval physiognomy by looking at the issue of scientific observation. If physiognomy, or if pre-modern physiognomy, should be studied in the context of the history of science, as I believe it should, what was its role in the narrative of the history of scientific observation? Medieval and early Renaissance learned physiognomy until at least the end of the 15th century was not an observational science. Its theoreticians were not empirically testing and exploring bodily signs, inferring from them general rules which could be applied universally. Their insights were not the results of cumulative experience, actively sought in nature and carefully tested. The physiognomic signs they were discussing were not the distillation of previous observations, similar but not identical. They were commenting the ancient authoritative texts, trying to harmonize them and to remove apparent contradictions between these texts and the natural reality familiar to them. But they were not interested to put the authoritative signs to tests or to collect new data, at least from what I have found. True, some innovative and daring thinkers such as Pietro d'Abano added several new bodily organs from which one could draw new and significant physiognomic insights. but it is impossible to say with any degree of certainty that this was the product of an act of active scientific observation. When Rolandus Scriptoris, the former dean of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris, used around 1430 the verb observare in his Reductorium Physiognomiae to describe his activity, he was observing ancient texts written by various authorities to extract physiognomic insights or to receive guidance how to advance his investigation. He was not collecting data in the natural world around him. To this non-observational mode, one can link another characteristic separating medieval physiognomy from its modern successor, the absence of measurements. The pre-modern physiognomy was expected to examine human bodies using vague and inaccurate categories of size and weight, and I found no attempt before the 15th century to provide the physiognomer with metric tools which could enhance the precision and hence the validity of the physiognomic judgment. There is in physiognomy no echo to the emergence of a quantitative medical theory in the early 14th century in intensive scholastic debates surrounding the science of physiognomy around 1300. At the same time, there is no trace of dissatisfaction in scholastic debates regarding the absence of an observational foundation in physiognomic arguments. In the long history of physiognomy, there are only few traces of direct observations at real people. Thus, Polemon of Laodicea, died in 144, Physiognomy, contains some detailed observations of his contemporaries, including Emperor Hadrian and his courtiers and the notorious cryptochild Favorinus. Medieval and early Renaissance physiognomic texts owe to Polemon their vignettes concerning the eyes of Alexander, Hadrian, or Socrates. Alexander's body was exemplary also when the overall proportion of the body was discussed in texts of medieval learned physiognomy. But medieval learned physiognomy shunned even passing references to contemporary celebrities who could serve as visual examples for specific signs or whole personality types. The only specific example I have come across before 1500 is in Pietro d'Abano's Liber Compilationis Physiognomiae from circa 1295, where the author devoted a long chapter to the various signs of the eye and included a specific reference to one of Frederick II's most loyal yet controversial Italian allies, Ezzelino da Romano, thus immortalizing in later physiognomic writings Ezzelino's dreadful eyes as representing the apex of cruelty. This short survey of the non-observational characteristic of late medieval, early Renaissance physiognomy ties well with the recently produced grand narrative of the history of scientific observation. And here I particularly refer to Histories of Scientific Observation, which was published last year and edited by Lauren Dustin and Lundberg. And there are two very good essays, introductory essays by Catherine Parker and Gianna Pomata, which survey the pre-modern picture. Others have already drawn our attention to the fact that the noun observatio or the verb observare rarely appear in medieval Latin scientific texts. When a medieval scientist describes a fact that he has required per experientiam, per inventionem, per experimentum, when he uses the verb ut vidi, ut notavi, ut consideravi, as I have seen, does it tell us that the fact was the result of an act of scientific observation, as we would understand it today? In an attempt to answer this question, what role did observation play in medieval natural philosophy, Edward Grant examined several 14th century examples of physical questions related to motion and vacuum. His conclusions were decisive. We see very little direct observation in the questions literature on Aristotle's natural books. Only few questions were decided by appeals to observation, normally identified in medieval natural philosophy by some form of the term experientia, rather than by any form of the term observatio. This was the case despite the fact that Aristotelianism was empirical and rooted in sense perception. It is thus no exaggeration, Grant concluded, to characterize medieval Aristotelianism as empiricism without observation. Most of the empirical elements in the questions were not directly observed by the authors, who perceived them secundum imaginationem in thought experiments. One can find powerful statements by Albertus Magnus, Roger Bacon, and Jean Buridan in favor of experience and observation, or the use of the sense perception rather than of reason. But this did not even approach the concept of experiment in the 17th century that involved the deliberate subjection of nature to searching, questioning, and active interrogation. Medieval scientists and natural philosophers thus did natural philosophy without nature through employing empiricism without observation. They did this by the assumption of counterfactual conditions and thought experiments, and this is the brief summary of Grant's thesis. Now, this is not so simple because traces of acts of observation, when a specific word denoting it, observatio, is actually missing, and instead employing ambiguous terms such as experimentum or experientia, and verbs such as videre, intuere, considerare, sporadically but not systematically, appeared in other late medieval scientific fields such as astronomy, optics, and the discussion of occult physical phenomena, magnetism, for example. Observatio, in a cognitive sense, was used with a narrow focus, the observation of the heavens only, in astrology. Only in the 16th century, tells us the grand narrative of the history of scientific observation, gradually emerged a new observing mentality among Western scientists. When it comes to the human body, traces of scientific observation can be found in individual cases of late medieval dissections of corpses performed for a variety of purposes. Without using the Latin verb observo, observare, various peoples, lay and professional alike, opened human, largely women's bodies in order to draw vital information concerning the woman's innermost self, to reveal the body's truths and the hidden physicality of the process of generation, to detect signs of hereditary diseases, or to find signs of sanctity. This they did by closely inspecting various internal parts of the bodies. In the beginning of the 16th century, or more precisely in the 1520s, they were describing what they were doing to the bodies as experiments, experientiae, to suggest a greater importance attributed to medical and natural philosophical expertise. Now, if such a development transformed the practice of looking at cadavers for medical and scientific purposes in the early 16th century, is it possible to detect a similar change among those trained to look at the surface of living bodies, the physiognomers? The case of Bartolomeo Rocca della Rocca Cocles, a graduate in medicine from Bologna, 1489, and a member of the close circle of the Aristotelian philosopher Alessandro Achillini, and the author of a 6-book physiognomic chiromantic compendium, which was printed in Bologna in 1504, hints at an affirmative reply to this question. The book is interlaced with dozens of textual portraits of people examined by him and used as a paradigmatic example for the trait or character in question. Such a presentation of physiognomic knowledge is, to my knowledge, without precedent. I would like to stress that medieval physiognomy, which is largely unedited, found in manuscripts, does not contain any iconographical aids. It's entirely textual. And I'm speaking of the period before the beginning of the appearance of iconographic aids. They start to appear in the 1520s only. Now, so this is why these portraits are really unprecedented. These literary portraits are entirely unprecedented. Taken together, these portraits seem to illustrate a clear need to base the validity of the physiognomic science on observation. First, come always the sign and the meanings, which are then followed by an observation that confirms them in real life. Cocles' book is replete with declaration that he has seen all these bodily phenomena he is recording, sicut vidi, sicut cognovi, sicut percipi, and that he knows their veracity through experience, per experientiam, having examined many cases. In the case of the chiromantic part of the book, Cocles maintains that he has checked 2,000 hands before coming up with a rule. The common physiognomic rule that a spherical head is related to a limited mental capacities, instability, memory problems, avarice, rudeness, envy, unreliability, and flawed estimative power, is corroborated by him having looked at and observed, so he says, at 10,000 men. It is particularly common. I'm not suggesting that one should take this as on flat value, but at least he pretends that what he says is based on not only on reading Aristotle. He is perhaps the last, I would call, medieval or standard medieval commentator of pseudo-Aristotle's physiognomy, but on checking in real life people. And he adds, it is particularly common among the French and the monks, this round head. While these numbers should not be taken literally, they do suggest that Cocles was keen on presenting his knowledge as the fruit of intensive and prolonged process of observation and accumulation of individual cases. Now, one can group the portraits which are spread throughout this book. I group them into three groups. One, those dealing with people whose sexual behavior was non-normative. And there's a long list of those who are prone to lust and fornication. There's a portrait of two prostitutes. There is a portrait of effeminate adolescents and grown-ups. There are several portraits of sodomites, young and elderly, passive and active. So he looks at people around him. So this is one group of people. The other one are portraits of those dealing with prominent political figures of his time, including various ecclesiastical dignitaries. Most notably, there is a portrait of Charles VIII, ordered around his notoriously large and aquiline nose. There is a portrait of Louis XII, the successor of Charles VIII, focusing also on his large nose and his fully blown and elevated nostrils, one of the clearest signs for violent type of character, full-blown nostrils. Cesare Borgia and Alexander VI, specifically targeting the dark red facial skin, a typical sign of fraud and deceit, and Girolamo Savonarola focusing on his eyes, which were situated secundum longum, presumably slanting eyes, which were regarded as a deviation from the natural condition of a horizontally situated eyes, secundum latitudinem, and are a sign of deceptive, envious character and of an extremely hot complexion. And the third group are of those dealing with particular social or professional groups, a typical monk, named soldiers and fighters and academics. Now, I have no time to go into, which I thought I would have to show you an example for each one of them, but I'll just read a very brief example from the last category, when Cocles devotes a detailed discussion to those who are naturally inclined to studying liberal arts and to engagement in other speculative intellectual activities that demand and promote the utmost intellectual sharpness. Such activity, intellectuals in humanities, if you wish, such activities is linked to an extraordinary capacity to remember things. To detect such people, physiognomers observe, inspiciunt, the posterior part of their head. If this seat of memory is lofty, if the overall complexion is dry and the neck vigorous and well proportioned, we judge this person to be of good memory, says Cocles. In the case of the most says Cocles, such a head I observed in the case of the most excellent teacher, learned in the arts of medicine, Master Natalinus de Monte Auro from Verona, who has an inestimable memory. This is immediately followed by a detailed portrait of an anonymous summus artista, philosophus, astronomusque, geomanticus, atque multarum disciplinarum recte consocius, who was taciturn and utterly unfriendly to the female gender, in addition, he adds. But this summus artista, this is his physiognomy. His physiognomia was characterized by moderate proportion, by moderate proportion and balance, included his physiognomy characterized by moderate proportion and balance included the following signs: average stature, muscular and bony appearance, a head with its proportionate, which is proportionate to the body, medium-sized neck, graceful ears and longish face more on the lean side. His color was a well-proportioned mixture of white and red. His hair was average, medius, in density and in roughness, dark but not black, and his square forehead was average. This idea of mediocritas is very strong in this description. His forehead was average in size and somewhat depressed in the middle. His soft eyes were between medii, varied and black, and his looks was similar to that of a cheerful, laughing person. His cheeks were roundish, his nose and mouth of middle size. His lips were fairly beautiful, and his teeth were symmetrical in size, neither too long nor too small. His chin was between round and sharp, his throat of proportionate size, his chest was of average size, his shoulders muscular, his belly was apt, neither fat nor too lean, and so were his flanks. The thighs and shins and the heels were most proportionate. The feet moderately fleshy, the surface of the sole was concave, the fingernails were flat, bright and naturally colored in a mixture of white and red. His soft touch, well-clinging voice and ordered language, erect and gratifying walk, and his gaze, which was directed towards the earth, as is common to thinkers, were other signs identifying the extraordinary intellectual capacities this summus artista had. Now, should one incorporate Bartolomeo's piercing and detailed gaze, and this is just an example, into the long history of scientific observation? Cocles was not producing pure data innocent of all authority. All the signs composing the portraits follow standard physiognomic manuals, especially that of Pietro d'Abano's Liber Compilationis Physiognomia. He was not looking for signs of lust on an anonymous person. He knew the professional preoccupation or the political behavior of his examinee when he was describing him. But when he created these portraits, was he merely trying to illustrate in words and to substantiate the validity of physiognomic knowledge, which was rooted in authoritative texts, pseudo-Aristotle and other ancient texts and the medieval commentators, or was he presenting the reader standardized bodies which were a distillation of many previous observations, similar but not identical, providing future physiognomers with grids of observation and enabling them to grasp the physiognomy of individuals at a glance? It was a long question, but now I'm not sure that I have a clear answer, but there are some indications in the text that perhaps one should give a positive answer to this question. Cocles' engagement in what one could describe as early acts of scientific observation and it does not only emerge from my exegetical efforts when I read and present the portraits. He himself describes his activity as observation, specifically using the noun observatio or even magna observatio, and I quote, "I have not found neither among the ancients nor among the moderni a magna observatio about those who would die in their own native land. But when I wanted to make a prognosis on this, I would consider whether there were signs signifying exile or death outside the native land. If I could not find such signs, I could prognosticate that they would die in their own house or in their native land. I have observed, notavi, many who had signs signifying journey, as well as signs signifying a severe disease for that age and season, especially a broken cardiac line. This was the case with a tender adolescent, Troilus Felsinus, who died in Parma, etc., etc." So he puts this element of observation into his discourse very clearly. It seems that Cocles collected data, created possible profile, which he then validated with a real case. Whether by observatio he meant the whole process or just the final outcome, a set of accepted signs that can be found in a single person, in his view, observation was an essential part of the physiognomer's task. Particularly revealing in this respect is the last chapter in Anastasis in his book. Together with Hippocrates and Galen, Cocles deems himself as belonging to the sapientes physici observatores cursus naturae, observers of the course of nature. Let me boast, he says, and reveals an unpleasant side of his personality, that Hermes, Aristotle, Albertus, Conciliator, i. Pietro d'Abano, Ptolemy, and other famous thinkers were not as great observers, magni observatores, of the plethora of individuals as I have been. From this emerges the need to prepare the setting for an undisturbed observation in every individual case of a physiognomic checkup. Most of the chapter is then devoted to meticulous instructions for the chiromancer in this case. Observe, aspicias, before, therefore, sober individuals, removed from the effects of intoxication and great labor. Avoid the interference of the weather in both intense heat and cold. Prepare the subject in a balanced place, removed from the solar rays, and shun the callousness of the hands together with bodily emptiness or need. You should not observe a person who is in a state of fear, extreme desire, in disease or in the midst of a process of convalescence, neither in a great joy nor sadness or in coital furore. For all these things alter the bodies, and the judgment cannot be whole. Observe, aspice, whether the individual has a crafty or a balanced nature. Only then start looking at the bodily signs. In the case of the chiromancer, the hands of the examined person, right head for the male, left hand for the female, should be washed with cold water, dried and rubbed with a linen cloth, and children younger than 4 years should not be examined. This, of course, was a practical advice meant to assure that a chiromantic examination would be conducted efficiently and validly. But appearing in the concluding chapter of the book, side by side with the self-identification as an observer of the course of nature, it presents a comprehensive picture of the art and science of physiognomy around 1500, according to Cocles. Both relied on careful observation, and which was the source of the science, as well as of the diagnosis and prognosis produced by the practical art. In this respect, and here I conclude, the last medieval-styled commentator of Aristotelian physiognomy dramatically departed from the medieval tradition. It would be rash to draw broad conclusions from a single case. One will need to study more deeply whether or not he was the harbinger of an observational mood, which would henceforth engulf a learned physiognomy. The fact that the abbreviated version of Anastasis, which became the source of his European fame among 16th century physiognomers, as it was translated to every possible European language, deleted these portraits, suggests that the long history of physiognomy and observation was not linear. But in the long history of scientific observation, one should, it seems, devote a footnote to this eccentric physician from Bologna, who provides us with one of the earliest examples of scientific observation in the Latin West. And here, physiognomy is, well, part of the emergence of a new scientific culture in early modern Europe.